Good afternoon, Your Excellency, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to our panel. On behalf of Department of Government, Faculty of Political Science, Chulalongkorn, and Direk Jayanama Research Center of Faculty of Political Science, Thammasat University, I'm pleased to welcome all of you to our public forum entitled Middle Classes in Southeast Asia, Hegemony and Illiberalism. Also welcome all of you who are watching this event from social media. The panel is now being held at Chumbhot-Pantip Conference Room at Chulalongkorn University. The forum is part of our public talk series by Faculty of Political Science Chulalongkorn in celebration of our department's 70th anniversary. So you can expect many more interesting academic forums to come throughout this year. And this time, it is our honor to have Direk Jayanama Research Center, which is directed by Ajarn Prajak here, who co-organized with us in this event. What question we are expecting to answer or inspire you to answer? Oh, sorry about this microphone. Can I use that for this? Technical error. Yeah, what question are we expecting to answer or inspire all of you to answer together? First of all, how liberal or illiberal Thai middle class is comparing to others in Southeast Asia. Do middle classes get along with democracy? We will address it theoretically and respond to that in Thai experience. What is the role of middle class in crisis of identity and ideology in this period? Why middle class go together quite well in our authoritarian regime, sadly to say. That's very important in this situation, and hopefully we might come up to ideas on how to resolve the polarized conflict in our societies. It is not often this kind of opportunity comes here to Chulalongkorn. You know, there is a big name on Southeast Asian study comes to visit us here and managed to have a great dialogue in one panel with our other big names. So everyone here is a big name. And both from Thammasat and Chulalongkorn. You know, normally we have to spend a lot of money to fly over to somewhere to have international conference to participate in this kind of panel. But they all come here at once and just give us an opportunity. And who are these big names people? First of all, our special guest, Dr. Erik Kuhonta, from Department of Political Science, McGill University in Canada. My first impression with him was back in 2009 when he started to think deeply about middle class in Thailand as well as in Southeast Asia, when we were visiting scholars in Gilbert at that time. And I had a few chances to listen to his idea and thoughts and found very fascinating, and he could contribute a lot to our Thai studies. And his co-edited book with other 5 scholars, Tongfu in 2008, entitled Southeast Asian in Political Science, was so fascinating. I think I recommend a lot of my students to read his book. And I would recommend you too to read his other books and a lot of publications that he had, including 2011, The Institution Imperative, and his book, and his other co-edited book on party system institutionalization in Asia, which is a very good book too. So I think it's our great pleasure to have him here with us and to listen to his talk and his thought on middle class. And who are the other 3? I think very familiar faces. They are all big names too, because we have a lot of alphabets in our names, including mine. And they all have been working on middle class, democratization, democratic transition in Thailand and Southeast Asia. So they are very excited to have, to join this panel to respond to Erik's presentation. I will give, after Erik presents, I will give Dr. Kanokrat from Chulalongkorn University from Political Science to respond to him first. She is my great colleague who loves working on social movements, civil society, and recently she just finished her working on PAD and PRC movement, the Yellow Shirt movement. So we will organize research story on her, we organized a panel on her research soon. So keep following. And after Ajarn Kanokrat, Ajarn Dulayaphab, Chaturongkul from Thammasat University, the Faculty of Political Science. He's a young and promising scholar who just finished publishing a theoretical paper on middle class.
Friend Viengrat, Nethipo, for inviting me here to Chula to give a talk, and I'm delighted and honored to be here at this university to share my work with you. And I also want to thank Ajarn Prajak Kongkirati for co-organizing this roundtable and all the panelists on this roundtable, this excellent roster of scholars from Thailand for engaging with my work and building on these ideas with all of you here. So thank you for coming out today. I also wanted to say that it's a very nice feeling to talk today, to have this roundtable today in the aftermath of the miraculous and incredible rescue of the 12 boys and their coach. So it's a great relief and a wonderful feeling to have this day in the aftermath of a very successful and wonderful rescue. Okay, so I'm going to talk for about 45, maximum 50 minutes, giving you my current project on the middle class in Southeast Asia. Let's put the power. Oops. So I'm writing this manuscript on the middle class and democracy in Southeast Asia, and I became broadly interested in this topic because of politics in Thailand. Now, I may probably say a number of details on Thai politics that you're all very familiar with, since I often give, this is the first time I'm giving a talk on my research in a formal sense in Thailand, so please bear with me if some details are quite obvious to you. But my interest in this topic on the middle class was spurred by the coup in 2006, in which and the aftermath of that, in which we saw the middle class very much supporting and legitimizing a coup by the military against Thaksin in 2006, and then the aftermath of that against the Samak Sundarawet government, against the Somchai Wongstawat government, and then later against Viengrat Shinawat. Constant mobilization, social mobilization by middle-class groups organized under the Yellow Shirts, and then later the People's Committee for the People's Democratic Reform Committee. And what we saw was that Bangkok was at a certain point paralyzed, the airports taken over, impossible to get to Government House. So a real effort to directly undermine elected democratic governments. Now, and the picture right here in the opening slide shows clearly the Yellow Shirts in action in the early 2006 period. Now, the behavior of the middle class is troubling because it undermines the democratic process of governmental change through the ballot box. In other words, it undermines the idea of universal franchise. And it's also disturbing because it also is a clear attack on the lower classes, the poor, who have been most loyal to the idea of universal franchise. But from a theoretical standpoint, it's also particularly puzzling. This anti-democratic behavior is puzzling because it goes against a large and very robust body of literature in political science that has long argued the middle class is a force for democratic change, is a harbinger for democratic change, a natural force for democratic transitions, for supporting democratic consolidation, for sustaining political stability. And that literature can be traced to some of the most prominent scholars in the field, from sociologists Barry Moore to political scientist Seymour Martin Lipset and many others in this field. And the idea is that the middle class is very educated, is tolerant, moderate, rational, progressive. They hold all these values that then strengthen and deepen a democratic political system. And this argument that the middle class is inherently liberal, progressive, and seeking democratic accountability as well as democratic participation is not a purely academic argument. It is not solely held or important within the ivory tower. It is also an argument that is subscribed to by popular media, by journalists, for example, in The Economist, and other very good publications, who often ask the question, when will China become democratic? Because China has high economic growth and consequently a significant middle class, and we should. So that idea that the middle class in developing countries is a force, inherent force for democratic change, is ensconced in the academic literature, but is also deeply embedded in popular media. So it is an argument that matters on a very practical level beyond purely theoretical literature.
Oh, point here. Yeah.
So, sorry, it's So I want to give you a quote from Aristotle back in 300 BC, more or less, where he says that the reason why democracies are generally secure and more permanent than oligarchies is the character of their middle class. Where democracies have no middle class and the poor are greatly superior in number, trouble ensues and they are speedily ruined. Let's read the last line again. Where democracies have no middle class and the poor are greatly superior in number, trouble ensues and they are speedily, and democracies are speedily ruined. So, Aristotle, very famous philosopher, political theorist, way back in ancient Greece, already setting the standard that without a middle class, democracies will collapse. And very interestingly, where the poor are greatly superior in number, trouble ensues, and we expect these regimes to collapse. So, venerable literature, Aristotle already making very clear the problem of middle class in democracy. But we can go closer to contemporary literature and look at the modernization theory. Modernization thesis is really the most important literature here. And they make a similar argument as Aristotle, but in a more causally analytical way. And modernization theory, so people like Barrington Moore and Seymour, and especially Seymour Martin Lipset, argue that changes in the economy, that is, the rise in per capita GDP, economic development, will lead to the rise of a middle class. As you get economic development, you get higher incomes, and so you get a more robust middle class emerging. And this middle class will have this will lead to a change in values and attitudes, meaning that there will be more educated people, more rational, more tolerant, more progressive, generally more liberal. And in these are higher order liberal aspirations, and in this group will seek democratic change because they want to participate in the political system and because they want to hold political leaders to some degree of accountability. So, change in the economic structure lead to the rise of an economic group, the middle class. That leads to a rise of particular kinds of values, rationality, progressiveness, liberal values, and then that leads to a desire for democratic political change. That's the general thinking of modernization theory. So, this leads us then to an analytical puzzle, and here's where I'm going to set up the question. How do we reconcile anti-democratic middle-class behavior in Southeast Asian countries, and I will focus on Thailand and Singapore as a comparative study. How do we reconcile anti-democratic middle-class behavior in Southeast Asian countries with a literature, a very venerable literature in political science that claims that the middle class is inherently democratic? So what I want to set up the puzzle is we empirically see, and I'll focus again on Thailand and Singapore, political behavior by the middle class that is illiberal and undemocratic, seeking to undermine democratically elected governments, and yet a literature in modernization, in comparative politics, political science, has long argued that there is something inherent, meaning natural, about the middle class being democratic. So that itself is an analytical paradox. The argument I'm going to pursue today is this, that ideology shapes the political behavior of the middle class, and then specifically that the middle class can be socialized into believing and accepting a conservative ideology that ultimately strengthens authoritarianism. So, I'm going to focus theoretically on ideology as driving the causal explanation. And within that, I'm going to say that the middle class is socialized into a particular kind of ideology, a conservative ideology, that has the ultimate effect of strengthening authoritarian regimes. So the focus on ideology, how it socializes the middle class, and how that then solidifies authoritarianism. That's the thrust of the argument today. Now, why does ideology matter? There's a tendency in the literature in political science to focus on institutional factors when explaining regime development, state formation, etc. In fact, much of my work is in terms of institutions, in terms of organizational structures, political parties, etc. And my work in the middle class is also focused on material interests. So in part, I want to shift the analytical focus away from purely institutionalist emphasis and look closely at ideology, which I'm going to argue is equally important in explaining political outcomes. Now, the second and third point I want to make about ideology is that ideology can become hegemonic and therefore decisively shape political behavior when there is no viable counter-ideology in society. And so, I'm going to argue that ideology does very much matter in shaping political outcomes and socializing middle classes, but I'm going to further argue that the ideology can become hegemonic. And I'm going to use hegemonic in terms of Antonio Gramsci, a communist Italian theorist who developed this idea of a cultural hegemony. And it becomes particularly hegemonic, by hegemonic meaning that there is no, that the ideas are taken for granted and no longer challenged. And it becomes hegemonic when there is nothing in society that can stand as a counter to this dominant mainstream position. And the third point I emphasize in this slide is that analytically, one might argue that it's difficult to process trace, meaning to causally link how ideas or ideology shape political outcomes. And it's much more difficult than showing how institutions or material interests shape outcomes. But I'm going to argue today that to the extent that I can show, that I can make an argument that ideology, that there is a particular kind of ideology that is dominant in society, if I can show that there is a dominant ideology in society, I'm also going to link that, I can plausibly link that to an outcome and to show that even if it's not the only thing that influences political outcomes, that influences behavior and therefore authoritarian regimes, I'm going to argue that it is one factor that is significant in explaining why certain social groups strengthen authoritarianism. So the argument is not that ideology is the only thing that matters, but I'm going to argue that it is a significant variable that helps explain the consolidation of authoritarianism through social forces. Now, some definitions to move forward so that we're clear with what we're talking about. Ideology is any comprehensive, I'm defining it as any comprehensive and mutually consistent set of ideas by which a social group makes sense of the world. It's relatively simple. Hegemony, an order in which a certain way of life and thought is dominant, in which one concept of reality is diffused through society in all its institutional manifestation. And this is directly from Gramsci. The key point in this definition is a certain way of life and thought is dominant and diffused throughout society, and crucially is taken for granted and no longer questioned. And then from Pierre Bourdieu, a French social theorist, an idea doxa, very much in line with hegemony, a set of core values and discourses that has come to be taken as inherently true and necessary, as naturally true and necessary. So hegemony of Gramsci and doxa of Bourdieu, very much similar in line with this concept of an ideology that becomes dominant, diffused throughout society, and no longer questioned or challenged. And that is a key theme I want to pursue in terms of how ideology matters in these two Southeast Asian countries. One quote that I think captures the importance of ideology by Bali Nasser, a dean at Tufts University, the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. He states that states can easily dominate their subjects physically, but to effectively rule over them, to establish hegemony over their lives in the Gramscian sense, they must also control their subjects ideologically. That is, control the cultural underpinnings of their social political outlook. And I took this quote because it says, yeah, physical force matters, but in fact, if you really want to control society, the ideological penetration is perhaps even more significant. Now, before moving to the cases of Thailand and Singapore, I want to, so I've just gone through ideology, the concept of ideology. I want to just briefly also stop and discuss the concept of the middle class. The concept of the middle class is a very slippery concept because middle class is in fact a residual category, meaning that it lies between the upper class, between capital and labor, between working class, and to the extent that it is squeezed between capital and labor, it's harder to identify. It's a residual category in that sense. So it's important to identify to really pin down what we mean by the middle class, and I'll define it in a second. But generally, what I want to make clear is by middle class, I'm really talking about white-collar professionals. That's the thrust of what I'm thinking about. And when we think middle class, we can think in terms of occupational categories, or we can think in terms of incomes. I'm really focused on occupational categories to identify who the middle class is. And this table here, from an ASEAN Statistical Yearbook, is meant to give you a sense of the numbers of the middle classes, the percentages of middle classes in Southeast Asia, so as to resolve the question of whether the middle class is a significant social force. In what sense does it really matter, at least numerically, within society? And I took the major capitalist countries in Southeast Asia. The key thing to look at in this table is the first four rows. This is 1 professionals, 2 administrative, executive, managerial workers, 3 clerical workers, and then middle class total. The total of those 3 rows, at least for this table, is the total of the middle class. And the main thing to get out of this table is that we can see very clearly that Singapore has more than 60% of the countries classified as middle class. Then Malaysia, and that's not surprising because Singapore has the highest per capita income in the region. Malaysia, not surprisingly, 34%, the second richest country in the region. And then, somewhat interestingly, the Philippines is a larger middle class than Thailand, but Thailand has, it's probably higher now, about 18%, more than 18%, and in Indonesia at about 8%. The basic point to get out of this table is that the middle class represents, in all the major Southeast Asian countries, capitalist countries, a significant body of population, and therefore a social group that we should take seriously as a sociological and political force. Their numbers, in other words, are very significant. Now, to give you an exact definition of middle class, we can get that already here from the occupation professionals, administrative, executive, managerial workers, and clerical workers. But I want to give you a very precise, concise definition of the middle class. The way I'm defining the middle class is as white-collar professional workers who are urbanized, university-educated, and are not owners of capital. And I'll just repeat that. I'm defining the middle class as white-collar professionals, university-educated, urban-based, and not owners of capital. So I want to be very clear about what I'm talking about. Now, what kind of groups is that within that definition? These are doctors, managers, executives, engineers, dentists, professors. We could include some, perhaps shopkeepers, but mainly, and in civil society, activists, NGO workers, but mainly these kinds of urban engineers, urban middle-class professionals, white-collar professionals. This is the group we're talking about. And this group, that in the past 30, 40 years, throughout Southeast Asia, has risen in prominence as Southeast Asia has grown economically. So this white-collar professional group, for example, very visible in 1992, in the May Uprising, is this class group that is very important in its economic rise, and it's this group that I want to focus on today. So I hope that's clear about which social force we're discussing. And finally, the argument I'm going to pursue today, before I'm going to now move toward the case studies, the argument is here. So if the only thing you remember for this presentation is just one slide, it's this slide to take home message. And the message, the argument is this, that two forms of ideologies I will look at today, what we know as Thai-style democracy in Thailand and in Singapore. I'm going to argue a composite ideology of survival, pragmatism, and meritocracy, that these two ideologies in Southeast Asia shape middle-class political behavior, and that in turn leads to support for authoritarianism. That's the basic of the argument. Specific ideologies, conservative ideologies in Thailand and Southeast and in Singapore, socialized middle class, and that has an important effect in terms of supporting authoritarian regimes. That's the thrust of the argument. Now, so let's look at the cases now. Let's go to the meat of the two cases, Thailand and Singapore. So I'm going to focus on Thai-style democracy as an ideology that has very much socialized the middle classes. And I just again want to define things so we're clear. Two definitions I'm going to put forth in terms of what is Thai-style democracy as an ideology. It is a form of democratic governance, according to the Chumbhot-Pantip Institute, a form of democratic governance which corresponds to Thai culture and context. Contemporary Thai dictionary defines it as a form of governance organized around democratic principles, but it is adjusted so that it corresponds to the historical evolution, culture, and traditions, as well as the context of Thailand, rendering it completely different from the concept of democracy accepted by the international community. That second definition, I think, gives us a good sense of what we're dealing with here. Corresponds to the historical evolution, culture, and traditions, as well as the context of Thailand. So, the norms, the values, the context, the cultural context of a specific country, of Thailand. And then the last clause, last phrase, rendering it completely different from the concept of democracy accepted by the international community. Virtually saying that it's not democracy, or at least it's not the mainstream liberal democracy. So this definition gives you a sense of the sources of Thai-style democracy and how it stands in contrast to conventional liberal democracy. Now, two individuals, I want to argue, have helped shape the idea of Thai-style democracy. These include Sairit Thainarat, Field Marshal Sairit Thainarat in the late 1950s and early 1960s, and then we will look at Kupri Pramod the journalist, intellectual, author, and also former prime minister. And these two individuals, I will argue, had a very significant role in developing the discourse of Thai-style democracy that in the contemporary politics, in current politics, still very much matters. And so 3 points I'm going to emphasize about Sadik's ideas of Thai-style democracy. One is that politics should be based on indigenous principles of the state, Lakkan Nuan Thai, meaning it has to be rooted in national, indigenous values, and these especially emphasize stability, order, and national unity. Stability, order, and national unity. The executive should be at the center of the political system. It should have absolute power, much more power than the legislative branch. And in these first 2 points, that politics has to be based on indigenous principles, Lakkan Nuan Thai, and the executive at the center of the political system, underlying these 2 points is the idea that liberal democracy in all its factionalism and competition and check and balance is problematic. Because what we value is stability, order, and national unity. And liberal democracy goes completely in the opposite direction with factions and political parties. And the third point is that the king is at the center of the political system for 2 reasons. One, the king provides legitimacy to the political system, and the king provides a balance among different factions within the political system. So these are 3 main points that Sadik's Thammasat made in terms of advocating for a Thai-style democracy. Kukrit Kamor also very much building on developing these ideas, and 2 initial points I want to emphasize. One, like Sadik emphasizes the monarchy at the center of the polity, and Kukrit emphasizes the legitimacy of that position because monarchy is rooted in Buddhist ethics and principles. Secondly, Kukrit argues for governance based on a very strict social hierarchy. In his model of the political system in Thailand, the king is at the center, the bureaucracy are on the sides, and then the people are on the edges of the political system. And crucially for Kukrit, the people must be cognizant of their place in society. They must know very well where they came from, and they must stick to their socio-economic rank in society. In essence, Kukrit calling for a feudal or caste system where everyone knows their place in society, and there is no social mobility. There should not be social mobility. Building on that, he calls for a political silence or an apolitical society with the good people, the Kondi, ruling. And like Sadik, the idea is again that democracy is something evil. It is evil because in democracy, the people from the edges are ruling the country from the periphery, and it is not their role to be ruling the country. Because it is not their role to be ruling the country, because these people are inherently self-interested. And their self-interest leads to chaos and instability in the political system. So, rather than having these self-interested people who don't know their place in society, Kukrit has argued that the right people, the good people, the Kondi, those from aristocracy, from royalty, from the elites, should be the ones ruling society. And once they rule, then there is stability. And in fact, these Kondi, Kukrit would argue, are above, are supra-politics in that sense, because they are not rooted in self-interest. And finally, Kukrit also argued that coups are necessary to establish stability and political order. It's somewhat ironic, given the fact that he was a prime minister in the mid-70s, and his own brother government, Sindhi, was undermined by a military coup, but nonetheless, Kukrit did make arguments that coups are necessary for stability and order. So, Kukrit and Sadik very much in line with this idea of a conservative Thai-style democracy rooted in order and in the lack of social mobility. I want to just contrast for a few minutes in this slide Thai-style democracy versus liberal democracy, simply to highlight, to contrast even further what we're talking about in terms of different kinds of ideas and discourses about different forms of governance. And so in a sense it summarizes the ideas of Kukrit and Sarit. So first, basis of legitimacy, I already made these points, but I want to underline them. Under Thai-style democracy, emphasis on legitimacy based on morality, moral principles, righteousness, Buddhist values. By contrast, liberal democracy, legitimacy is based on the rule of law, on fair procedures, and the idea of universal franchise and majoritarianism. These kinds of procedures solidify democracy. In Thai-style democracy, completely different, a sense of religious or moral values sustaining the legitimizing the system. Competition, in Thai-style democracy, the emphasis is on unity and order. In liberal democracy, it's on political contestation. Competition is part of the way a political system works, check and balance within the system, constant back and forth, would in fact reflect a healthy, vibrant polity, but not so under Thai-style democracy. In terms of the actors, Thai-style democracy, Kondi, qualified people, supposedly qualified people, good men, or maybe virtuous men. Liberal democracy, these are simply elected politicians, elected by the universal franchise. Role of the monarchy in Thai-style democracy, it is the core of the political system, and it serves as a moral check and balance on the government. In liberal democracy, if it is present, it has symbolic power. In terms of social hierarchy, we saw from Kukrit that this is very important. Individuals should know their place in society. There should be limited social mobility and virtually a feudal kind of structure. Liberal democracy, theoretically, you should have equality among members of society. Now, we all know that that's not really true in liberal democracy, but at least prima facie, that is what should be, that is the assumption of how democracy should work. And then finally, to the role of coups in Thai-style democracy, as we saw, this is seen as acceptable, as a way of maintaining stability, while for liberal democracy, coups are seen as just outright illegitimate. So, stark contrast between Thai-style democracy and liberal democracy, and the contrast I want to argue is a very strong ideological distinction. Now, quickly, I want to make the point that these ideas that we saw coming out of Sarit and Kukrit have a causal impact, meaning they influence very directly the current politics in Thailand today. And they influence the choices, the practical proposals, policies, choices, advocacies that the middle class groups are making, have made in the past 2006, 12, 13 years. And this is reflected in People's Alliance for Democracy, the Yellow Shirts, and the People's Democratic Reform Committee. I won't go through all of these because I may be running out of time, but I will just briefly say from this slide that things like arguing that Parliament should not be made up of completely elected MPs. Here you see the first line under People's Alliance for Democracy, but the initial ratio proposed was 70 elected MPs and 30 selected members from different sectoral representation, from different groups in society, and then later the argument that the position, I got the ratio wrong, 70 selected members, and then 30 elected, and then later it was changed to 50-50. But the idea that in Parliament it should not just be elected MPs, it should also be members selected, indirectly chosen from sectoral representation, so it's not purely the self-interested politicians. Same points that I made with Kukrit and Sarit, you see in very practical terms that good people should govern, the Prime Minister should be selected, not just from MPs, but also the sectoral representation should matter, the military should control the government, and both the PAD and the People's Democratic Reform Committee, the idea of a People's Assembly should be there that should check Parliament, and the PDRC, idea of electoral reform, of anti-corruption, all of these initiatives all of these initiatives driven by the idea that there's something inherently dirty and self-interested about democratic politicians, and we have to get the good people to constrain them, to control them. And that is a way to ensure a more workable, democratic, stable political system. That's the thrust of these points being made by the PAD and the People's Democratic Reform Committee. And what I'm arguing is that that comes directly, very clearly directly, from discourse by Sarit and Kongkirati. And then if you get to the most recent 4 years, we have General Prajak also pursuing this vision of a Thai-style democracy. If we see in particular the 2017 Constitution, the Senate is not going to be elected. There is a clause, an article, I believe it's Article 219, that says that there should be a check on the morality of the ethics of the MPs, and the Constitution also maintains many executive orders that have strengthened the authoritarian regime. So again, a clear descendant of the idea of Thai-style democracy. So the effect in the contemporary politics, I argue, is very real, very palpable. And that gets me now to moving to Singapore. And I have just, I'd like to end by 2 o'clock, so I have about 10 minutes. I will probably go through Singapore a little bit more quickly, and then I will conclude by summarizing the argument and the broader implications of this presentation. Now, Singapore, I want to give a few points before going to the details on Singapore. One is that the PAP has never lost elections. The People's Action Party, a dominant party in Singapore, has never lost elections since 1959. The dominant, institutionalized, programmatic party, completely in control in Singapore. 2009 survey showed that 93% of people expressed satisfaction with the way Singapore has been governed. It's an extremely high percentage. Happiness index. If anyone is, I subscribe to National Geographic. In this past year, I believe it was 8-9 months ago, there was an issue on the happiness index. The cover was on the happiness in a number of countries, and Singapore ranked as one of the countries with the highest happiness index, similar to countries like Costa Rica and Denmark. Costa Rica, Denmark, not surprising, given they're quite strong social welfare states, but Singapore, interestingly enough, ranked as one of the countries with the highest happiness index. And so what I'm trying to build up here is that there is a lot of satisfaction, happiness, with, in effect, an authoritarian regime in control since 1959. As we saw in the earlier table about the numbers in the middle class, Singapore has the largest middle class in Southeast Asia. That's very clear, given the highest per capita income. But this middle class has never mobilized on the streets against an authoritarian regime. So again, another point to emphasize the degree of acquiescence of the middle class to, in effect, an authoritarian party. And the last point I want to make is that the middle class has at times criticized the PAP in the Straits Times, which is a major newspaper in Singapore. So I don't want to paint a complete picture of middle class totally passive vis-a-vis an authoritarian regime. And in criticizing the PAP, for example, on this thing called the Graduate Mother Scheme that Lee Kuan Yew in the 1980s had come up with, which he saw the problem in Singapore in the 1980s of highly educated professional women not having enough children, while working class women having too many children, and so we had this incentive for the professional women to have more children, while for the working class women to have less children, including sterilization. And that was seen as really excessive, verging on eugenics, and so the middle class really criticized that, and the PAP was forced to retreat. That's a good example of a situation where the middle class has responded to the PAP and forced the PAP to change its policy. So there is some, I don't want to say there's no back and forth, there is some back and forth between the middle class and the PAP. But in a broad ideological sense, in terms of the broad ideological direction that the PAP has taken the country, for the most part, I argue that the middle class has more or less accepted and supported the general ideological direction that Singapore is taking under the PAP since 1959. Now, The ideologies that I argue are central to the way the PAP has governed and basically socialized and co-opted the middle class are these three: survival, pragmatism, and meritocracy. These are the three key elements of the ideology, that the hegemonic ideology that sustains the PAP. The cumulative effect of these ideologies is to reinforce the idea that the PAP is, number one, fit to govern. Fit to govern because of the idea of meritocracy. That's central to the PAP's vision. Secondly, that it governs effectively, that is, pragmatically, not based on ideological dogma. And third, it governs in a very challenging environment. The odds are against the PAP, against Singapore, and yet it survives. These three things, survival, pragmatism, and meritocracy, are a very powerful hegemonic ideology that basically justifies why the PAP should remain in power, and in effect why authoritarianism should persist. And I've argued that the middle class in Singapore has more or less acquiesced, accepted, and seen as valid this kind of argument, this kind of discourse. So, to go through the three. Survival. And I'll go through a few quotes or a few examples just to give you a sense of what we're talking about. The idea that of Singapore, of the PAP, is basically that Singapore is in a very difficult position. It's a small city-state. It's in a sea of Malay populations. It has to deal with economic crises in the region. It has to deal with infectious diseases. It has to deal with ethnic, religious tensions. It has to deal with terrorism. And yet, it is able to survive. And why is it able to survive? We'll see, because of meritocracy and pragmatism of the PAP. So here's a good quote. Goh Chok Tong, Prime Minister after Lee Kuan Yew, stated that Britain is a super tanker. She can zigzag without capsizing. Singapore is a sampan. If we zigzag, we would surely sink. That's a pretty simple, clear example of how the PAP elite see themselves. They're in a very difficult position, very unstable. We've got to be careful, otherwise we will naturally sink. Lee Hsien Loong, and most recently National Day rally, emphasizing in his speech very clearly Islamization threat to the nation. And Ambassador Bilahari Kausikan, an important elite among the PAP, recently talking about Singapore in a complicated and dangerous region. All of these are examples of the elites in Singapore emphasizing endlessly that Singapore is in a very difficult position, complicated by numerous geopolitical, economic factors, and for the very reason, you have to stick with the dominant party. And one last quote. I thought this year, Goh Chok Tong was speaking to journalists in the Straits Times, and he basically, took down the journalist through this argument. And he says, you can't slow down. If I may give an example, let's take the port of Singapore. Can you slow down? Why do you want to work 365 days a year and 24 hours a day? Slow down, relax. If you're just being sarcastic, slow down, relax. Then what happens? Tanjung Pilepas, New Malaysian port will take over. Westport will take over. And then what do we become? In this game, if you're not number one or number two, you are nothing. In transshipment port goes to the other side, what do you do? So we have to be realistic. I think that's a good response by the Prime Minister to a journalist saying, this is exactly why we have to keep on pushing, because we are in a very difficult position, and the implicit point being we are the ones who maintain Singapore in a challenging environment. Then the second plank of the ideology is pragmatism, meaning do what works. The argument is that Singapore should pursue programs in politics that work irrespective of the ideological nature of such policies. And here what this means is the PAP is not in any way ideological, it simply does what is in the best interest of the nation. It looks and it cares about nation building, political development, economic development, and is not wedded to any particular ideology. What that means is, how can you be against a party that looks out in the best interest of the nation? And furthermore, the emphasis of the PAP is on science, technology, rational public administration. These anchor pragmatism. And again, how can you be against these kinds of objective criteria of advancement and development? And then the third plank of the ideology is meritocracy. This is one very powerful ideology that the PAP constantly returns to. Meritocracy defined as the practice that rewards individual merit with social rank, job positions, higher incomes, or general recognition and prestige. And the basic point of this is to argue that, that those who work hard, who pursue effective work, therefore are rewarded with prestigious positions and with recognition. And who are the ones working hard for the country, who should therefore be rewarded with this recognition? The PAP. In a narrow sense, this is an aristocracy of talent. And here this gets us back to Thai-style democracy, the idea of Kondi. So there's some similarities here, although Kondi, those who deserve to rule, the good people, although one can argue that in Singapore, the PAP technocrats have proven in a more clear way the merit than the idea and the concept of Kondi in Thailand. But nonetheless, the idea of aristocracy of talent is similar across both discourses. The problem here, however, is that this masks deep inequality, the assumption straight out of individualism that those who rise up in the ranks are simply better than those who didn't rise up, but that hides the fact that society, there are inherent inequalities in society, and some people are born with greater advantages than others, and this the PAP refuses to acknowledge. So the manifestation and consequence of these ideologies. The presidency, the election of the presidency is reserved, so these are practical consequences of this kind of discourse and ideology. One is that the presidency is reserved for the technocratic elite, meaning that the president has symbolic power in Singapore, but nonetheless a very important office. And that means that the only ones who can run for president are elites, in line with this argument about meritocracy. And so only the former cabinet members, former chief justice, former permanent secretaries, former chairmen of statutory boards, only these kinds of economic, business, political elites are allowed to run for the presidency. So if you're from the working class, you have no right to run for the presidency. Another important manifestation of these ideologies is that this is an argument that has been made by a young scholar, Walid Abdullah, in a journal article, and so I'm taking from his argument. A very interesting argument that although you see the Workers' Party opposing the PAP and winning recently some seats against the PAP, the argument he is making is that the Workers' Party ideologically is not that different from the PAP. And this is quite an interesting argument because we tend to believe that the Workers' Party in Singapore is quite a contrast to the PAP. In fact, the only difference, perhaps the main difference, is in terms of the Workers' Party calling for a minimum wage, but in many other respects, such as accepting the racial order in Singapore and other elements of how ethnicity and race are tied to education, the Workers' Party does not challenge the PAP. So, if Singaporeans vote for the Workers' Party, an argument out there might be that they're not really seeking deep ideological change. There are other parties out there that are much more ideologically in contrast to the PAP, but they gain much fewer votes than the Workers' Party. And so trust in these ideologies leads to political obedience and political acquiescence by the middle class. This is a manifestation, a behavioral manifestation of the ideology of the PAP. And the ultimate consequence, both face this, so this is the practical long-term effect, is that the PAP have earned the legitimacy to continue governing, to rule, because they do so effectively under tough conditions. So the discourse of pragmatism, survival, meritocracy gives the legitimacy, the basis, the justification for why the PAP should continue to govern. Now, I'm going to end in 2 minutes, but I just want to, just before I end, I just want to put a parenthetical point. Anyone who's following Singapore knows very well that in the 2011, I think I missed this slide. Yeah. In the 2011 elections, the vote share of the PAP actually went down quite significantly to 60%. So you can see the trend in the past 4 elections, although it went back up in 2015. So just before I conclude, I just want to respond to a counter argument to what I've been proposing here, that perhaps there is a middle class response to the PAP if we look at 2011 and see that in fact the PAP lost significant vote share to 60%. That's the lowest vote share the PAP has ever had. And maybe that might represent the middle class awakening against the PAP. Is that the case? So I just want to address that in 2 minutes here. There's a lot of information on the slide, and I'm just going to summarize it quickly. These 2 constituencies voted against the PAP. The first one, Ajarn, had 5 seats. It's a block constituency, meaning all 5 seats go to one party. 5 seats went to the Workers' Party. The other one, Hogan, had 1 seat, one seat district, and went to the Workers' Party. So 6 seats right here gave the Workers' Party 6 seats. The 6 seats held against the PAP. What are those constituencies like? Are they where the middle class resides? The answer is no. These are, in the first one, you can see economically heterogeneous constituency. In the second one, a very working class constituency, heavily represented by ethnic Chinese. Ethnic Chinese in Singapore means often more working class than the more, those who speak Chinese dialects, generally more from the working class areas than those who are English educated. And so it means more, so this constituency more working class. So the point being that these 6 seats that weakened the PAP in 2011 did not come from the middle class, they came from the working class. So it is not a middle class awakening against the PAP, largely it is the working class that has challenged the PAP. That's the main point I want to make in these slides. Just very quickly, I'll just rush through this. The PAP, in fact, responded to their losses in the 2011 elections by a number of policies. The percentages just showed they cut down the salaries of the Prime President, Prime Minister, and Cabinet Minister to ensure more accountability. Housing, they tried to reduce the housing prices, they tried to make it easier for people to buy flats, and they improved transportation. It's a wholesale effort to respond to some discontent, especially by the working class. And the result, and also they shifted the discourse of meritocracy to reduce the kind of forceful way that they discuss meritocracy. So what we can infer is that the constituencies that voted against the PAP were not solely middle class or high income, and that following the 2011 election, the votes in these constituencies declined for the Workers' Party. So even in the 2016 election, these 2 constituencies, Ajarn and Hogan, the percentage of votes for the Workers' Party actually declined in 2016 following the PAP's effort to gain back their support. So the main point I wanted to make just before concluding was that even if in 2011 the PAP lost significant votes and had its lowest vote share ever since 1959, only 60%, that weakness did not come from middle class awakening, but largely from working class districts. So we then get to our conclusion. I apologize, I've probably gone a bit longer than I intended to. A few points I want to summarize and also discuss the broader implications. First, that the middle class in Southeast Asia do not necessarily think or behave in a universal liberal manner. The middle class can be anti or pro-democratic. And again, from the beginning I've said the modernization literature argues the middle class is inherently democratic. I've argued that's not the case. I do not want to, the argument is actually more complex. I'm not arguing the middle class is always anti-democratic, but the main point I wanted to make vis-a-vis modernization is the middle class is not always democratic. The middle class can switch back and forth. And in Singapore and Thailand, we can see very clearly periods when the middle class can sustain anti-democratic positions. In Singapore for a long time, in Thailand back and forth, and recently clearly in an anti-democratic position. The way to pursue the argument is by focusing analytically on ideology as shaping the politics, socializing the politics of the middle class, particularly in a hegemonic sense. In Thailand, I've argued the middle class is rooted in a conservative ideology of Thai-style democracy. I've gone through those details. And the progenitors, the intellectual progenitors of this discourse, this ideology. In Singapore, I've argued the middle class might seek to pursue a check and balance function of the PAP, for example, challenging it on the graft of letter speed or writing letters to disgrace times. So there might be some back and forth, but never to overthrow it. And what indicates is a general acquiescence and acceptance of PAP power and ideology. And the last point is that the irony of this is that it is the more educated middle classes that are deeply socialized into the hegemonic vision of authoritarian elites, and not the working classes who have challenged authoritarian regimes much more consistently than the middle classes. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Erik. Not many political scientists who can combine theoretical framework with very good inside information, and Erik always has done very well. Thank you so much for your argument, really point out to the core and the root of modernization thesis. And yet you also fabricated well into explanation of dominant ideology. And me particularly like very much that you combine this ideology to the illiberal behavior of the middle class, and you also show very insightful information. It's brilliant. I really enjoyed it so much. So let's move to Ajarn Kanokrat from Faculty of Political Science, Chulalongkorn University, to see what she would respond to this presentation. Ajarn Kanokrat, please.
Thank you, Ajarn Viengrat, and thank you for inviting me and have a chance to listen to these very interesting ideas from Ajarn Erik. What I'm going to talk about today is not responding directly to the paper or presentation by Professor Erik in particular, but I'm going to respond to the whole set of ideas that how people, academics in particular, try to answer the questions of what is happening with the Thai middle class, why these earlier democratic thoughts turn into conservative and anti-democratic side. First of all, I would like to portray that what are the earlier efforts by academia and many people who are interested in the political conflict and situation of the Thai middle class. I sum up here that there are about 5 sets, actually there can be more than this, but at least there are about 5 or 6 sets of arguments. The arguments we have done earlier by the research and civil rights team that why the Thai middle class have turned into undemocratic behavior and support undemocratic ideas. The first set of literature described the Thai middle class as pragmatist force. In choosing between the liberal and democratic or conservative and anti-democracy is a pragmatic decision in protecting and enhancing their self-interest. So calling for democratization and political liberalization during the 1970s and 1990s was only for protecting themselves from abusive bureaucratic elites. And by 1990s, the Thai middle class left institutionalized democracy and turned them into structural minority and become political tools to legitimize elected elites like Thaksin, as well as peripheral new middle class. At the same time, they were under the pressure being switched by the upper abusive elected new elites, and on the other side by the new emerging urban middle class. So in that sense, in switching to the non-democratic idea is more or less is a pragmatic choice that trying to mobilize a new force and legitimacy to going against their enemy. This is probably one of the several academic papers and several writings come up with this kind of conclusion and how can we explain the Thai middle class. And the second set of writing is more on the hegemony project of the conservative elites. Correct me if I'm wrong, what Professor Erik tried to portray, tried to explain us, his argument is also come into this kind of category. But his work is more complex. But I just would like to draw out that this is a second set of writings that focus more on the predominant right-wing elements among middle class. While the right-wing institutes successfully promote their hegemony project, the radical and progressive force fail in offering alternatives. Therefore, when Thai middle class confront with the economic crisis, social and political instability, they held back the right-wing idea guided by the old regimes and right-wing leaders. And that's mean in explaining why the Thai middle class switched back to the conservative idea is because of the successful hegemony project of the conservative elites. This is probably the two dominant ideas of how to explain the switch back and forth between the Thai middle class and between the liberal and conservative ideas. Aside from this, there are many other papers that you can go through. I have an endless list of this that explain the switch back and forth as a class-based conflict between the urban and rural dichotomy, between the Thai middle class, urban with particular interest, and the rural one. And the fourth set of literature is about information gaps between the middle class, more educated, that perceive themselves as who can access to the more complicated and sophisticated information. And the last one is an undemocratic internal culture. There are several sets of writings focused mainly on the internal undemocratic culture of the Thai middle class, particularly among the Thai NGOs, Thai progressive activists, earlier progressive activists. However, after I went through all this literature, I found that there are several limitations amongst these offers. The first is the strict dichotomy between the left and right, conservative and liberal socialization amongst the Thai middle class. And the second one is many of the earlier research focused mainly on the elites and the leaderships among the Thai middle class who mobilized the anti-democratic movement, either PAD or PDRC. So what I have tried to do, different from earlier works, I try to explain the Thai middle class. Different from earlier works explaining Thai middle class as a liberal or pro-democratic during the 1970s and 1990s, and surprisingly 180-degree switch to conservative. I try to look at the interaction between the liberal and conservative ideas among this middle class. At the same time, I did in my research, but haven't come up yet, I tried to propose a very initial stage of the idea that I'm drawing out the paper. And just like to throw it here to Ajarn Erik and others and help and would like to get some of the feedback and what do you think about my argument. And I did some interviews with the middle class, about 50 middle class. All of them are not the leaderships in the movement. They are ordinary yellow shirt supporters active in different degrees. And at the same time, I try to look at them in a more structural way to understand how the democratization process, particularly the difference between the democratic transition period and democratic consolidation period, that how the middle class interact, fit in, fight and struggle to survive during these two periods. Because when we are talking about democratization, we look at that as a homogeneous, as it is the same process. But in reality, during the democratic transition and democratic consolidation, the political institutes, the political forces accommodate themselves and trying to use the different process in different way. So this is the initial idea that I try to find a new way to explain that why the Thai middle class switched from liberal to conservative. Through this new set of data, this work find that the progressive middle class didn't switch. They didn't switch or shift back and forth between liberal and democratic. A liberal and democracy to conservative and anti-democratic direction. Either only because they are pragmatists, just throw away one idea and pick another, one way or the other as a political tool, or would easily transform from the conservative hegemony project to conservative zombie. It was not that easy. The first set of argument that we'll go through is, this work argued that the progressive middle class haven't switched from liberal to conservative. From the empirical data, they have long exposed to social life through exercise, live with and develop a profound relationship between both liberal and conservative ideas. As well as switching turn from one side to another side, battle against the antagonist, to mobilize resources to reason and to legitimize their stance through both sides. Or in short, the Thai middle class have long comfortably learned, live with, and use this contradictory dichotomy through the development of their political activism. Majority of them found both are useful when with no contradictory. During the early stage of the middle class, during the early stage of the middle class in 1970s, the progressive middle class developed activism through hybrid idea among the liberal, loyalism, Maoism, conservative, and nationalism. You can read this in Prajak thesis, that they have tried to frame up with this hybrid idea. They use the live with, they accommodate with both sides in various kinds of ideas. And in the early 1990s, they mixed the ideas during the May incident in 1992, during the rise of the social movement in Thailand during the 1990s, during the political reforms that they have played a very crucial roles. They mixed ideas of anti-corrupted electoral with the anti-authoritarian power in defending their political power. Through the 1990s, they mixed both nationalism, localism, communitarianism, and liberal reformers in their campaigns to support the social movement and political reform. And in anti-Thaksin, we see the mix of liberal and democratic language, the conservative ideologies, and different kinds of rhetoric and ideas. So first set of argument is around here. I found that they are living, used, and socialized to both sides. And on the second set of argument that link with the first one is, looking at them through the true period of democratic transition and democratic consolidation. Looking at them in both sets of process, we found that dropping out, highlighting and strengthening either liberal, democratic, conservative ideas and alliance was a result of changes in relationship with their potential alliance and threat, in irony with democracy in transition and consolidation of democratization. Although in the reality, the progressive middle class mix and match both liberal and conservative idea and alliance all along with their political activism. Being suppressed during the 1990s, being suppressed by the conservative elites who have been long against democracy. Liberal and democracy were the ideological ground for them in legitimizing their political activism, as well as strengthening the alliance with liberal and mass poor that was during the democratic transition in 1970s. However, under democratic consolidation in 1990s onwards, in spite of keeping themselves on using liberal and democratic rhetoric, the earlier democratic transition maker middle class gradually dropped out. Several liberal and democratic ideas, ideological elements, and focused more on the conservative campaign and alliance. This change was not only shifted in strategy, but interweaving the conservative idea elements between the progressive middle class and conservative elite into a new condition of democratic consolidation. In a more institutionalized democracy, elected elites and new middle class, new lower middle class who claim their legitimacy to democracy and liberalism become more powerful than the established middle class during the 1970s. The minority middle class felt that the earlier established middle class felt that they were marginalized from the new state of democratic consolidation. Therefore, they questioned liberalism and democracy both in terms of strategy and ideas. Comparing to the powerful elected politician and pro-democratic mass, the old conservative elites look relatively less powerful and threatening for this middle class. Their early progressive middle class repositioned themselves as a new potential alliance. Not only as a strategic alliance, ideas promoted by conservative elites, including ultra-nationalism, loyalism, moralism, matched with the conservative elements that the middle class have long socialized and utilized since 1970s. This means the conservative elites and ideas help in recovering their political identity and power and over the irony result of democratization process. This is probably the brief ideas that I would like to throw to add from the comment from Erik and others as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kanokrat. Yeah, thank you for trying to break through all the limits of the previous literature exists about middle class in Thailand. You're probably the only one middle class in our country who think so much about themselves critically. I think we all other middle class, spend much time thinking about ourselves, particularly critically, like you do. Thank you so much, and probably it would be useful for people who study about middle class later, including me. Thank you, and let's move to Ajarn Dulayaphab from Faculty of Political Science, Thammasat University, to see what he will get from.
Hello everyone, it's an honor for me to be able to give some reflections on the topic of liberalism and democratization. First of all, my discussion will be formed in direct response to Erik's work. Without further ado, let me begin. There are 3 points I wish to make. The first being in line with your, which in this case is Erik's discussion. The second and third, however, being complementary. The first concerns the disconnection between Aristotle and modernization theory. The second concerns the liberalism democracy dichotomy thesis. And the third concerns the liberalism continuum thesis. That said, let me begin by addressing your methodological assumptions. A misreading of Aristotle suggests a fundamental flaw in modernization theory. Modernization theory states that economic growth, industrialization, and so on reinforce civic attitudes and the values necessary for creating and sustaining a democracy. But such causal connection is vague, to say the least. For the causal connection to be well cemented, strong assumptions are needed to corroborate the natural propensity of individuals with higher levels of economic income to strive for civic cultivation. And it is precisely this set of assumptions that modernization theorists feel inclined to make, yet it not only fails to describe the observable political behavior of actually existing middle classes across a wide range of contexts, but also runs afoul of what Aristotle, to whom modernization theorists feel indebted, actually had in mind. You see, the Aristotelian understanding of democracy actually states that increased levels of economic income, material being, and education are by themselves not sufficient guarantors of democratization. In Aristotle's own words, these only enable a citizen to have enough freedom to excel in what he calls phronesis or practical wisdom, which is something akin to means and rationality to modern ears, not human excellence as such, which denotes quite a different order of things, an order which I should say is coterminous with being virtuous and responsible citizens. Of course, Aristotle argues that these are necessary, although insufficient. It would be virtually impossible to cultivate one's civic virtue if one can't even sustain one's living. But the point that bears emphasizing is how a civic culture also needs to be put in place for a democracy to even arise. And at this juncture, the laws and customs of a political society are particularly integral to fostering such a culture. Because as an adequate measure of preventing moral deterioration which results from excessive material indulgence and the politically sanctioned laws that supposedly embody the collective virtue needed to found a civic community of equals, people can't suddenly be incentivized to democratize without what Aristotle calls habituation, a socialization process best facilitated through state mechanisms. The observations of Aristotle in his own days was that people, when left to their own avarice, would become disoriented from their common striving for collective self-determination, which is another name for democracy. Astonishingly and worryingly, a stark comparison can be made with the predicament we are currently faced as Thais. And as I will argue in my second point, the wisdom democracy dichotomy thesis, the ascendancy of a liberal ethos that appears in tandem with the liberalizing effects of modernization may very well lead to a degeneration of democratic ideals. So yes, I think you're right to fault modernization theory for imposing implausible demands on the very people it didn't even strive to understand. Or to put it differently, they are more concerned with what ought than what is, with how people ought to act than with what their actual behavior are, thus leading to a glaring discrepancy between what ought and what is. But before turning to the second point, let me quickly address one thing, which is the point where my discussion begins to stray from yours. Let me first set a few things straight by responding to your understanding of middle class. While I register to how you made what you identified as the new middle class as distinct from the traditional bourgeoisie, the petty bourgeoisie, and the marginal middle class, the focal point of your analysis, because I do not wish to contest your empirical claim that the group has gained the most economic growth in Southeast Asia, I am, however, less settled by the question of whether it actually constitutes a residual concept of the capital-labor dichotomy. Inasmuch as you want to dissociate the new middle class from the strict dichotomy between capital and labor, I don't think this obscures the fact that in Thailand at least, this class appears to be a natural extension of capital. This is the Marxist challenge I want you to keep in mind as I will try to level it upon your analysis. It success as a harbinger of democracy, I think, depends on how you answer this challenge. Would it ally itself with owners of capital at the expense of the lower wage earning providers of labor, or would it rather function as a mediator between the two? What larger sum of benefit will this bring by acting as a mediator? As it turns out, and as I will try to make systematic sense of, the new middle class stands to gain more from aligning with capital than with labor, both economically and politically. But in order to get to the bottom of this, we must understand and sufficiently distinguish between the democratic ideal of equality from which qualified labor derives its greatest utility, and qualified labor here, I'm referring to the lower wage earning laborers, which is why I use the word qualified. So it doesn't signify labor in general, which is labor in the unqualified sense. And the liberal ideal of freedom from which capital and her lieutenants, namely those members of the new middle class who feed on her superstructure, derive their greatest utility. This points to how the notion of liberal democracy belies its supposedly unified origins. For the egalitarianism associated with democracy's impulse marks labor's attempt to contest the liberal hegemony of the libertarian capitalist classes. Just as the opposition between labor and capital sets into motion two opposed visions of the ideal society, one classless and the other hierarchical, so the distinction between ruler and ruled supposes one system of government that tries to perpetuate it, while the other tries to displace it with an ideally all-inclusive notion of rulership. This is the liberalism democracy dichotomy thesis, which forms the second point of my discussion. The concept of liberalism, to which the notion of bourgeois mentality belongs, prizes economic freedom over state-sanctioned equal distribution of wealth. That is, taxing the rich to fund robust social welfare programs that generally benefit the poor. The rich, in response, feel justified to protest because they register to the view that government interference amounts to transgression when it robs them of that sacred right to life, liberty, and most importantly, private possession. Moreover, the liberal bourgeoisie, in contradiction to the equality-seeking lower classes, which desire to rule, only desire to be left alone. What does this mean? They just want to be able to get on with their daily business in the private sphere, and demanded not only that they do not have to constantly engage in politics, but that they also have a select few, namely members of the impersonal technocratic class of liberal public decision makers, do it on their behalf to ensure that they be left unperturbed by the masses and their populist leaders wishing to take matters into their own hands. Time and again, we see this sort of liberal blueprint at work as a general pattern of thinking among different species of middle classes across time and space. On this note, one way of grounding the opposition between liberalism and democracy would be to acknowledge that when democracy is construed in its purest sense as direct democracy, or direct participation of all citizens in governmental affairs, its exact opposite is the attribution of anarchy to this, and the consequent heralding of political inequality over equal empowerment, which is liberalism. As such, liberty-seeking, petty, white-collar professionals cannot feel any more content with their position within the top-down hierarchy, so long as this is necessary to prevent any deterioration into anarchy. Just as on one extreme we have an ideology whose fate lies in the demos, which is the masses, so its opposite would be to have an ideology whose fate is fundamentally elitist in its assumption of guardianship over the same demos. The fact that we we witness so many members of the new middle class feeling justified enough to blame the lower classes for their country's ills, for voting someone like Thaksin into office and corroborating the disturbing truth that they exemplify the worst of what can happen under the unbridled impulse of democracy, only makes it all the more sensible why they are so wary of democracy, instead of looking to it as a beacon of hope and progress. To remedy democracy's defect, they thus found it safer to invoke its logical opposite, guardianship by a liberal Kanokrat, or a natural aristocracy positioned at the apex of a hierarchy of natural talents, as opposed to an artificial one positioned at the apex of a hierarchy founded on tradition. So whether they are aware of it or not, their intellectual patron here is John Stuart Mill, a philosopher famously known for sharpening liberty, but also openly criticizing the one-man, one-vote principle. Indeed, Ajarn Prajak points that in 2014, the PDRC has disrupted the voting process and publicly stated that the basic principle of one-man, one-vote is not suitable to Thailand, where the majority of voters are still poor, uneducated, and ignorant. He also adds, it was striking that in 2014, the Red Church political campaign was respect my vote, while the anti-Viengrat one was respect my tax. You see, these are perfect iterations of the ideological contest between equality and liberty, between the egalitarianism espoused by the Red Shirt illiberal democratizers and the libertarianism espoused by the Yellow Shirt undemocratic liberalizers, in Ajarn's words. However, this still begs the question, and this is very important, as to why the freedom-loving bourgeois liberals might still want to affiliate themselves with authority-loving statist conservatives. This is the puzzle, I think. The obvious answer to this is pragmatism, for me at least. To be sure, if Thai-style democracy, or should I rightly say Thai conservatism, which is the least bit democratic, represents an ideology which revolves around the quasi-Thamic royal nationalist principle of king, religion, and country, then surely liberalism, which is another name for the hatred, arbitrary exercises of state power believed to affect negative economic outcomes, stands in stark opposition to it. Therefore, it would seem quite a stretch to attribute liberalism's, and I wish to emphasize here, internal logic with authoritarian consequences. The most we can accord to liberalism is elitism. The ideal liberal polis is indeed one that is furnished with a robust system of checks and balances, which can ultimately circumscribe the illiberal tendencies of politicians and prevent them from harnessing the dangerous potential of the masses, as well as ward off the possibility that public decision-making might be centralized under the personalized administration of some arbitrary government like the NCPO. So a plausible explanation for liberalism's external alliance with conservatism, and this is my answer to the paradox, then is its perception of Thaksin and the democratic challenge he posed as a greater threat. This brings me to my third and final point. The liberalism-conservatism continuum thesis. Although it is of paramount importance that we first try to situate the curious alliance between the liberals and the conservatives against the backdrop of an unavoidable discontinuity between them in terms of their conflicting ideological predispositions, it is imperative that from this preliminary finding we proceed to a more qualified explanation of people who don't fit squarely within one box, liberal or conservative. Let me raise an example. Consider this guy called Prisha, a public secondary school teacher born into the fourth generation of a family of civil servants, who tunes into his favorite liberal talk show each time it is aired. Prisha now teaches social studies and somehow struggles to reconcile his conservative upbringing with his liberal intrigues. If Prisha succeeds in reconciling this, he would come up with something like, rather than doing with this maxim, rather than doing away with personal autonomy entirely, there should be enough non-moral alternatives for citizens to choose from in a country that fetishizes morality. In the literature, this is called libertarian paternalism, and I think like Amartya Sen and Martin Nussbaum talks about it. Conversely, consider Prajak, a businessman born into a bourgeois Sino-Thai family who underwent at least 12 years of royal nationalistic indoctrination at school. Prajak now inherits his family's company and proudly wears his "I love the king" wristband to work each day. As you can see, I try to account for people like Mr. Prisha and Mr. Prajak by not casting them as residual categories of a strict economy, but as categories that correspond to varying degrees of liberalism and conservatism. Indeed, I am construing the liberal-conservative dichotomy as a continuum of opposing differences made possible through the various blending and balancing of these two ideologies. Socialization and education are the crucial components, and this is where I think my work fits with Ajarn's own work. My intuition is that the distribution is crunched in the center of the continuum here, meaning that we get something like a normal distribution. But that's just my lousy hypothesis because I don't have the numbers. I'm hoping that Ajarn's numbers can corroborate or undercut my hypothesis here. Numbers aside though, Mr. Prisha and Mr. Prajak are purely fictional characters. It is worth stressing that they are far from fictitious. To conclude, all things considered, I think my overall message is this. You don't have to resort to the new middle classes or the white-collar professionals to follow Erik's taxonomy to high-style democracy in order to explain why they're behaving so undemocratically. Citing liberalism is enough. The alleged undemocraticness of liberals doesn't warrant explanation via its association with statist conservatism when it can simply be explained via its natural opposition towards the ideal of democracy itself. Yep, that's everything.
Thank you very much. Thank you for bringing us to a lot of debates from the classic to many debates, and mainly the dichotomy of liberalism and democracy, which we can really find, we can relate to Ajarn's remarks, previously remarked from her empirical research. And I really love that what he renamed the Thai-style democracy into something else, very fancy and interesting. Okay, we don't have much time left for Prajak, but I'm sure within this short time he would manage to tell us a lot. So please welcome Prajak.
Thank you, Ajarn Viengrat. I'm very happy to have the chance to co-organize this event with Political Science faculty of Chulalongkorn University. I'm getting older, so I talk slower and have less energy than Ajarn Dulayaphab. So I try to make my point as brief as possible, so we have time for Q&A. Start from admiration. I think Erik asked a question that looks simplistic, but a very, very crucial puzzle in political science and also in the real world, right? Why middle classes in Thailand and so many countries around the world? I think beyond Southeast Asia too, right? The contribution of your work, not only in Southeast Asia and Thailand, but you see the phenomenon that middle class in many countries go against democracy. Okay, so I think your work is very important. So I will start from the point that I want to discuss with Erik, and since you're working on this project, my conversation is more on how you can strengthen your argument, and the rest of my presentation is just want to emphasize a point by using some case studies. Okay, so it's quite ironic today because normally Erik has been known as an institutionalist guy, and I am more a cultural politics who emphasize the role of ideology. But today, in this presentation, Erik bring ideology back into the study of the middle class and democracy. For me today, my critique or my point that I want to make is I want you to bring institutional back in into the discussion, because I think that it's very important to understand the political behavior and attitudes of the middle class. So the first point first, political socialization. You discuss the idea of Sari and then Kuhonta, and then you say, okay, this Thai style democracy become hegemonic idea, and then you jump into the present day of Prajut application of this idea and impose on the Thai society. So I think that there are many missing links. You may discuss in detail in paper in the future, but I think it would be very important to show the concrete mechanisms and the process, how socialized process occur, how this idea of the leaders, right, the Kuhonta and Sari, in Sari's speech, in Kuhonta writing, who read it, you have to show how this idea translate into the people mind. I mean, through education, mass media, or something else. Otherwise, people might argue that, okay, it's just, I mean, the elite ideology, the elite writing. How many people seriously read Kuhonta writing? So his idea must appear and be translated into some other channels, right? That would be very effective in socializing people's mind. And the second point is about the counter ideology. You talk about the Thai style democracy, and also in the Singapore case, right? That the state, the elite, conservative elite, created this idea, okay, and it becomes hegemony. Seems like there's no counter ideology, but in the Thai case, I think you know very well that since 1970s, there are many new ideas and ideology emerge from time to time to challenge this notion of Thai style democracy, right? The Marxism, the leftist idea, and in 1990, you have a liberal democratic reformist idea, right, to challenge this Thai style democracy. So the story is more contestation of ideologies. So you have to show more of this complex situation that the elite, conservative elite themselves, they have to struggle a lot from time to time in order to establish this notion of Thai style democracy as a hegemonic idea. And nowadays, even under the Prajut regime, I think the Thai style democracy has been challenged very strongly by various group of people. The next point is, I want you to show more how this argument of you can be applied beyond Thailand and Singapore. Now I'm thinking of Malaysia. Malaysia just has been through a significant change, right? You see the middle class, the urban middle class, overwhelmingly voted for the opposition party, right? Topple the ruling party, the UMNO, which is a twin of the PAP in Singapore. So in this case, we might argue that the middle class in Malaysia fit quite well with the modernization theory. If you see the pattern of voting, clearly that the opposition party very strong in the urban area among the middle class who are highly educated and professional. So the case of Malaysia might be a case that actually proves that modernization theory is true. Okay? Indonesia is another interesting case. I remember you also discussed about Indonesia. Under Suharto, yes, middle class support Suharto. But then in 1998, the student movement and the urban middle class also becoming a democratic force. And since then, now 20 years of reformacy anniversary, we can argue that Indonesia is a role model of democracy in the region. And I think throughout these 2 decades, urban middle class is not going against democracy in Indonesia. So when you think of other cases beyond Singapore and Thailand, I can think of the case that can counter-argue your point. So I want you to discuss more of other cases. And the last point is, I think historical context is important to understand the role of middle class in Southeast Asia, that they're against or pro-democracy. Historical context of the development, historical context of democratic transition, and I think which state of development at that time when the democratization took place, I think shaped the role of the middle class. So in 1970s, right, you see the pro-democracy role of Thai middle class. And that might be related to the stage of economic development at that time. Okay, I will go to other points very quickly. So you look from the middle class and try to understand the behavior of the middle class. I think to understand the role of the middle class, we might need to start from comparing the type of the authoritarian regime. So authoritarian regime in Singapore and Thailand are different. Sarit regime and Prajak regime are different, even though both of them are authoritarianism, right? So the castle that you ask, why middle class go against democracy sometimes? But under some other context, they support democracy. You have to look at the regime behavior and performance too, right? So I think compare Thailand and Singapore, for example, Kondi in Singapore or technocratic elite in Singapore are a lot smarter and more competent. If I live in Singapore, maybe I pro PAP too. I don't know. I live happily and the leaders look less corrupt and quite competent in running the country. Okay. In Thailand, under Sarit, under Thanom especially, very abusive, very corrupt, economy is running down. So you have so many factors that propel middle class to go against Sarit. So compared to Prajut, you might have to contrast these two regimes. So I think, okay. And Singapore, under PAP, okay, it is not true democratic regime, but it's not full-blown authoritarianism too, right? It's more hybrid. So it's understandable that under hybrid regime, that they still accept the contestation of power, electoral norms, come to election. The middle class are not going against them or want to topple them, right? Because at least they accept democratic principles of contestation. So I think it's another side of coin, which I think is important. And now I bring historical and institutional back in. I think look at a broad picture throughout time. Southeast Asia is a region where authoritarian regimes outnumber democracies in almost every country. And liberalism and dualism have struggled to become mainstream ideology. I think almost every country is a start, right? You see a weakness of liberal democratic principles. The more popular and powerful form of ideology in Southeast Asia are royalism, nationalism, and communalism. So, from this perspective, maybe it's quite understandable why conservative ideas are quite deep-rooted in the region, and why middle class subscribe to this idea, because the liberal universalism idea are weak, right? Look historically since the start. And in the current situation, because of the global development and the social inequality, also give rise to populism, which become a challenge for the liberal democratic order. And that link to Dulayaphab discussion on the tension between liberalism and democracy. When you have a populist government like Duterte, Estrada, or Thaksin create a populist policy that benefit the poor who are majority of the voters, the middle class felt that their interests were threatened, that the starting point of their turning against democracy, right? The yellow shirt and then the PDRC. So I think that the populism, the inequality as a structural condition of that underpin the middle class anti-democracy behavior need to be taken into account. Okay. It's funny, now I'm become political economist, right? It's your job. And on institutional factors, I think look overall in our region, liberal democratic ideas are and have been challenged all the time. You see the absence of strong policy or ideological difference among political parties. Parties are quite weak and not different much in terms of ideology. That giving rise to the nationalism, populist, and conservative ideas. Right? Also, weak or absence of liberal, reformist, social democratic or leftist political force also provided space for nationalism and populism to grow. So I think it's like an institutional deficit. The weak of political party that very strong in progressive idea, socialist idea, liberal democratic idea. So in terms of market of idea or policy choice, middle class have not much to choose from, right? So, and that explains the phenomenon, the dominance of the idea of Thainess, for example, royal nationalism in the Thai case. Okay. The labor union is quite weak. In many other countries, so civil society is quite weak. So I think this structural condition and the weakness of the institutional building also explain it quite easy for middle class to subscribe to the social norms, political norms, conservative ideas. Okay, I will skip some other issues. Because I don't want to take too much time. We can come back to this on the Q&A. I think Indonesia and Malaysia are two interesting cases to discuss. Overall, I think we see illiberalism in Southeast Asia, not just today, but in the past several decades. But talk about the current situation, you see the shrinking civil space and freedom of speech in almost every country. Pluralism is in danger. Political conflict increasingly relies on the employment of different variations of religious and nationalist ideologies. So my main point is, in order to understand what you call the anti-democratic behavior of the middle class in the region, we need to bring back the historical context, historical development, the institutional character of the authoritarian regime, and also the phenomenon of the populist elected elite who are strong on democratic side but quite weak on liberalism. People like Thaksin, who destroy the check and balance mechanism, right, make threat to the press freedom idea. So this kind of hybrid regime make middle class turn against elected government. And also the institutional problem of weak political parties, weak civil society, and weak social force who support the liberal democratic ideas, make it quite lacking in the region for the middle class, right, who can play a role of democratic forces. So I'm not defending the middle class, but I think there's an institutional factor and historical factor that explain the middle class behavior, not only the hegemonic idea of the conservative elite. That's it.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Ajarn Prajak. Thank you for well thought discussion that you gave to Erik, and overall study. He jumped out of the debate inside the ideology to point out the historical and institutional context very well, and would make it more exciting if Erik or anyone who is interested in this topic would add these factors in. So I think Erik would have an urge to respond a bit. You want to? For 5 to 10 minutes before, briefly, before we open the floor for everyone. Okay, please welcome everyone.
Thank you very much to these wonderful comments, both broadly on the topic and then specifically my paper. I don't want to take too much time because we've been sitting here for quite a while. I'd love to hear, I think the whole panel would like to hear from comments from the floor, but I'll just 5 minutes, just make some quick responses to the excellent comments from the fellow panelists. And just because there's so much on the table, I'll just perhaps go in order. Just in terms of the general points, one of the general points that Kanokrat made was that the middle class has not really switched from liberalism to conservatism, but that they've been socialized in both liberal and conservative ideas since the 1970s. I largely agree with this point. Perhaps in the presentation that I put forth, it gave too strong a view that the middle class just has to be completely illiberal, and that maybe that's oversimplifying things. In fact, there is much more complexity, as we all know. In Thailand in 1973, the middle class students were able to overthrow a military regime, Kanokrat. Similarly, 1992. So there has been back and forth, and I'm going to respond to Prajak's comments in a second, and the back and forth is very, very important. In terms of Dulayaphob's comments, these are very, very good, broad lines of thinking about Aristotle, modernization, and the tensions between liberalism and democracy. What I'll simply say is that when Dulayaphab was talking about the middle class, where does it stand vis-a-vis the other classes? Is it a national extension of capital? How do we understand it as a residual category, and how it positions itself? One thing that matters, I think, for the middle class is how they perceive their status and the threat from other social groups. So the extent to which they perceive threat from the lower classes, that I think helps to solidify themselves as a class in their own right. On the issue of liberalism versus democracy, this inherent dichotomy, and in the earlier quote or comment, maybe citation from Cassian about red shirt illiberal democratizers versus yellow shirt undemocratic liberalizers. I'm not so sure I agree with that, with the way that is put forth, to the extent that, I mean, if we say that the yellow shirts have some liberal elements, but that they are undemocratic, yeah, I'm not so sure I'd agree with that. I would actually say that clearly undemocratic against a universal franchise. Do they have liberal elements? Is their main concern horizontal accountability or rule of law? If they acted in that manner, then one might argue yes. If their politics, if their actual manifestation, practical manifestation reflected a respect for rule of law, then one might say they are liberals in that sense. But I think there's strong evidence that they have not acted within the confines of rule of law. In fact, quite the opposite. So, to make it, this same contrast, liberal democratizers versus yellow shirt, undemocratic liberalizers, neat, but not convincing for me. Now, lastly, very briefly, to respond to Prajak, fantastic comments, critique. I completely agree with the thrust, the details and thrust of these, and I think these are extremely insightful comments. I won't respond to everything in the interest of time, but let me just pick a few things. I agree that, so maybe one way to respond in the big picture to Prajak's comments is to simply say that that what I presented, so for example, it's interesting, we're sort of switching roles when I explain them or whatever, this cultural, ideological, analytical position, and Prajak, a historical institutionalist / political economy. And usually I take what Prajak is saying as my analytical position. And the reason for that is because what I presented is actually an offshoot of a larger project on middle-class economic interests and how institutional structures affect middle-class political behavior. And a larger project, a lot of that actually responds exactly to what Prajak, not everything. I think Prajak has identified things that I have also missed in the other project, but many of the my other larger project responds to Prajak's comments. So in effect, I completely agree with Prajak that the middle class has not always been undemocratic. The larger project I advanced shows the middle class has actually shifted back and forth. They've shifted back and forth, and they have shifted back and forth depending on how institutions have addressed their economic interests. And so the argument I put forth in this other study on the middle class is that if the institutions address their economic interests, they tend to sustain the regime. But if not, there tends to be much more fluctuation in middle class politics. So that, I think, is an effort to sort of complexify things, and in contrast to what I presented here, perhaps here it's a little bit too stark. in terms of the way I position the middle classes. In terms of the comparative perspective beyond Thailand and Singapore, this is very important. I think we can see in countries like Venezuela, at least during the Chavez period, when the middle class sought to undermine an elected government, Hugo Chavez. In Egypt, where the secularists and the liberals undermined the elected government of the Muslim Brotherhood and brought back the military regime, we see similar problems of the middle class going against democratic governments. But the larger point that Prajak made in terms of comparing with Malaysia and Indonesia in the post-1998 period is that middle classes forces can also be democratic. And so we know in East Asia, in Korea, in Taiwan, in the Philippines, Korea, and Taiwan 86, 87, the Philippines 1986, and Thailand 1992, we know very well that the middle class has also pursued democratic change. So a broader comparative historical perspective would in fact make this the role of the middle class much more complex. And so in the broad thrust of where Prajak is coming from, in terms of historical institutionalism and a broader comparative context, I agree largely with those points. The last thing I might say is that I would agree that with Prajak that this is an error in the way I presented the presentation today, that there are other ideologies out there challenging the mainstream Thai-style democracy, conservative royalist position. It's true there are other ideologies in the 1970s, Marxism, etc. In the 1990s, when they argued liberal democracy had more flowering. So that does need to be more complexified. But I would still somewhat hold to my position that when push comes to shove, there is still somewhat of a hegemonic outlook, perhaps not completely hegemonic, but I would argue that it tends to be still, Marxism has by no means gained any foothold, significant foothold in Thailand, and among mainstream urban middle class professional, these other ideologies are very much on the margin. So perhaps it's a little bit more complex than the way I provided, but I would still push back and say that there is some hegemonic position out there that occupies the mainstream.
Thank you all of you. So now the discussion is yours. Please, if you want to have a question, just introduce yourself and please keep it briefly. Okay, raise your hand. Oh, please, gentlemen, over there. Introduce yourself too.
Thank you very much. My name is Erik. I come from Indonesia, and actually I'm very interested with the discussion on the role of middle class in Southeast Asia, and when you mentioned about Indonesia, it's also very interesting that the perception of Indonesian middle class is like a role model, but actually in Indonesia itself, like in the mid of 2000, we start to disbelieve in the middle class as a role model, because when the government start to apply the austerity program, with cut off the subsidy and so on, and when the labor did the strike on the street, the middle class complaining because it's disrupt their way to the office. So we start to thinking whether the middle class in Indonesia can bring the liberalism or democratism, because after the 1998, it seems they are declining their role. So we cannot conclude right now what is the future for Indonesian democracy, but we're doubting that it's in the middle class. That's the first comment. And the second one, I would like to ask for you guys about because it seems that this the role of the youth, the young generation, missing from our discussion, because when we see now how the development of the young people using the technology, and they are really independent with communication and with the words and so on and so on. So what do you think about the future of democracy if our present middle class right now, if it's become more conservative, can we put our hope to the young people? That's my question. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Let's attack Kanokrat. You want to respond a bit about the young generation?
I think we'd like to listen
Okay,
to
so,
the
yeah.
question first.
And if we collect a few more questions, please. Okay, Kanokrat.
สวัสดีครับKanokrat from ประชาไทยครับผม so Mr. Kuhonta, you mentioned about the Thai style democracy imposed by Sarit Thanara, and you say that Prayut Chan-o-cha is also following those kind of ideology, right? So my question is that under Sarit regime, this ideology, this hegemonic ideology was overthrown by the new emerging middle class and the student movement in the 14th October events. My question is that can that phenomenon, that circumstance happen again under this regime or not?
Good, thank you. More questions, please? Yes.
Hi, my name is Ajarn from Georgetown University, and I would like to ask some clarifying question to Ajarn Prajak. When you mentioned that the new middle class is an extension of capital, could you please, in your answer, clarify this process? Is it because of the characterization of the democratic ideal of equality as libertarian versus Marxism, or is there some other explanation to this idea that you propose? Thank you.
More questions? Ajarn Siddhipan. Okay, Ajarn Siddhipan.
Abhichan. I'm a development specialist by training, so I tend to look at things from a more developmental perspective. Let's say comparing between Southeast Asia and Northeast Asia. In this case, Northeast Asia like Taiwan and Korea, where they had very authoritarian, right? Let's say going back 40, 50 years ago, and then somehow they were able to transition into now more or less, a full-fledged democracy. And then Southeast Asia is a bit stuck, sort of up and down, but there's no trend that sort of break through, So I was just interested whether, we talk about middle class, we also talk about middle income country, we also talk about middle income trap, and it seems that many of the countries in Southeast Asia, except maybe for Singapore, has not broken out of the middle income trap, including Thailand. So is there a sort of a correlation, maybe, I don't know whether anybody has studied, where those countries that have break out of the middle income trap into higher income, Taiwan and Korea, seems to have managed to have more mature democracy or liberalism or something, whereas countries that are stuck in middle income politics, a trap, or whatever you want to call it, would continue to be in that kind of state. I don't know, is there any correlation? But it seems that at least the apparent, information or data seems to point in that direction. And then, I guess, just to illustrate, the case of Southeast Asia, you have, let's say, countries like Philippines who has a popularly elected leader, but then it's now becoming more dictatorial, right? To put it plainly. Cambodia is going to election soon, but their democracy is also going in the other way, into a more dictatorial sort of fashion. Or even if you talk about Aung San Suu Kyi, freedom fighter many years, not too long ago, and then now, what stage is that at? Okay, so that means sometimes not necessarily personality, but the system or the institution that needs to be a little bit tweaked or something like that. Or even if you take a look at the US, would you consider US still a democracy? And if the Trump supporters will say, yeah, this is a democracy, we have overthrown the establishment, So then what was the establishment? Was that a democracy? You know, who is right and who is wrong, okay? Just to throw out a few things. Thank you.
Thank you, Ajarn. Yeah, when we come to developmental aspect, are very complex and much more to discuss. So, more questions, please? No? Okay, first round, let me allow these speakers to respond. Maybe start from you, Ajarn.
I just would like to respond to the questions about the future generation, the youngster, the teenager, what we would like to make it. I think there are 2 points that I would like to make. The first is similar to when we are talking about middle class, we are pointing and make the youth movement as a wishful force in the democratization, but I think it's more complicated than that. It's not, if we use the modernization theory to explain them, we're gonna feel very depressed because it's not gonna happen in the way that it's happened during the 1960s or 70s. There are 2 cases. The first is in Thailand now, under the very suppressive and limited political structure, when none other political force have been able to mobilize. In Thailand, because of the legacy of the earlier successful and legitimacy of the student movements, I think in Thailand now, during at this stage, the youth movement are a hope for the democratic movement in Thailand, because there are still only few sources of political mobilization that are still able to mobilize the democratic movement, anti-dictatorial regime, as far as I have concerned. But if you're talking about the mass student movement as it happened during the 1970s, we are talking about another factor. We are talking about the economic determinism. We are talking about other political structural explanation. I think it's so my answer to this question, yes, if we are talking about small group of very progressive, radical student activists under this limited political condition. But if we are talking about a mass student mobilization, it's pretty hard under this condition.
So, sorry, to the individual, and taking this to Indonesia a little bit, I think what might be interesting is looking at, for example, in the last election, we have elections coming pretty soon, but in the last election, if you look at the constituencies that supported Prabowo versus the ones that supported Jokowi, I haven't done research, but some of my Indonesian friends, Indonesian colleagues, have hinted at the fact that Prabowo had significant support from middle-class groups. Now, of course, it's in the context of liberal elections, but Prabowo, for a military figure, quite illiberal, I think one might make an argument that that does reinforce the position that at least a significant group of the middle class is willing to go along with a general sense, quite illiberal figure. To the journalist from Prajadhipok, can we have something like similar to October 1973 in the current context? I don't think that's very likely. And I don't think it's likely because the conditions are quite different. You have here a military that has established quite a tight grip in the past 4 years, and coercively being quite effective in the grip and undermine very much dissidents and opponents, not completely, but for the most part being able to push that down. I think what was crucial in 1973 was that the triumvirate of Kanokrat and then the son-in-law Narong were seen as deeply corrupt, especially the idea that Narong, with nepotism, Narong would rise up to the ranks with this father-in-law was seen as too much. And so the weight of the corruption in '73 was just in some sense unbearable for the authoritarian regime. Perhaps if Sarit had been there, maybe the 1973 would not have happened. But that triumvirate was not particularly effective. So I think what matters also is the extent to which the military in control, individuals and institutions in control, are quite effective in the use of coercive institutions. Ajarn Apichai, that's a very interesting, broad question. And what I would, in some sense you're asking, in contrasting Taiwan, South Korea, that have escaped the middle income trap with Southeast Asia that has not, whether there is some correlation between economic development and democracy. And South Korea and Taiwan might make one give us a sense that there is, but Singapore doesn't, because Singapore may have escaped the middle income trap, but it is not a democracy. And earlier to respond to Prajak's earlier comments, Singapore could be seen as a hybrid regime, but I would actually put it not quite as hybrid as Malaysia becoming even more democratic, but in general I would not put it as quite as hybrid as Malaysia, and to the extent that the one-party dominance of the PAP, yes, they have regular elections every 5 years approximately, but the degree to which the opposition is so deeply constrained has historically made it very unlikely that there could be change, and so in some sense the classification of Singapore is more as a one-party democracy, a one-party authoritarian regime than a competitive hybrid regime. So there is some debate one can have on that matter. But so I'm not too sure that the development democracy correlation is really there, given the position of Singapore. What I would argue, though, that links Taiwan and Korea to Singapore, and it contrasts with other Southeast Asian countries like Thailand, Philippines, Indonesia, is the origins, the nature of institutions. And here I'm coming back to my true self of being a historical institutionalist. I think Taiwan and South Korea have had very strong states. The literature, developmental state literature, makes that very clear. And the bureaucratic development, the executive capacity, the forward-looking programmatic policies of Pak Chung-hee, of Zhang Jingguo, that is what has really propelled Taiwan and South Korea out of the middle income trap. So I don't think it's really a correlation between development and democracy as much as it is the origins of institutions. Singapore, I think, fits that mold of very strong bureaucratic executive institutions, as well as strong party organization. The combination of party, state, bureaucracy has propelled Singapore forward. Other countries like Thailand, Indonesia, Philippines don't match what Korea, Taiwan, and Singapore have. So I argue for a much more institutionalist, historical institutionalist explanation for contrasting the relative developmental success of Northeast Asia and Singapore with the relative middle-level development of countries like Philippines, Indonesia, and Thailand.
Thank you. Dulayaphab, would you like to comment?
Responding to your question concerning what actually meant by the new marginal classes being merely an extension of capital. Of course, by definition, as Erik has mentioned at the outset, right? They're not the owners of capital. So what does it mean then to be an extension of capital? Well, let me qualify it a bit more. When I refer to capital, I'm referring to, say, the owners of capital. So being their extension is like being someone who is loyal to them. Loyal to them in the sense that they benefit from having a top-down capitalist system being in place, even if they are not in the higher up positions of the hierarchy, right? Because if we try to understand the various cross sections of the hierarchy, of course, the entities of people that are in the higher up positions are the owners of capital, right? And when Marx talked about, the various social strata, you have the owners of capital who can be separated into two groups. The one called the bourgeoisie, the other one called the petty bourgeoisie, which are the small shop owners. And then what Erik introduced is not the petty bourgeoisie, but even lower than that. But what I'm saying is that even if they don't belong to that category of ownership, right? It doesn't mean that they don't want to align to the owners of capital. I guess what they're afraid of is that any change to the structure coming from below would make them less well off than they currently are. So they're afraid that so they might not hope to go higher up, right? But they're more afraid of going down. So they're happy just the way it is because they're afraid that any changes would just make them worse off. So yeah, that's what I meant.
Okay, thank you, Ajarn Dulayaphab. We have a little bit of time left for comments. Doesn't have to be questions.
Some questions come. My name is Meritocracy from the Faculty of Political Science in Chulalongkorn University. I have two questions. The first one is that when we, in the case of Thailand, when we consider the red shirt movement and the yellow shirt movement, and also the PDRC, it also seems to be that the social division in Thailand can be explained by the regional geographical lines between the southern part of Thailand and the north and the northeastern part of Thailand. So how do you reconcile this phenomena with the explanation regarding the class struggle from the panelists? And my second question is that how your response and how this phenomena of the class will have the implications for the future of Southeast Asia regarding how to socialize the middle class to be more democratic, and also about the future of the polity in this region in general. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, particularly I like the regional preference that no other panelists here mentioned about it. Yeah, that's a very good point. More comments and questions?
Follow on. Erik, maybe on your statistics, I think you were citing us in statistical yearbook. I think there are now more recent statistics, yeah? So maybe because yours is only at least 12 or more years old. So I'd like to see what's the current, more or less the latest trend, even on your statistics. Okay. I mean, I don't know whether there's also this Northeast, Southeast Asia, that sort of differences. But maybe there is also some cultural, social cultural, perhaps explanation. Why I say that is that, for example, Singapore, I admit that, yeah, it's already broken through, and it's a high-income country. But I think it's situated in Southeast Asia, okay? And I don't know whether that is a constraint in itself. And plus, it is a city-state, of course. In that sense, it's not comparable to any other, Southeast Asian country. And then, like last week, I was also attending a seminar here in Chula, where there was a speaker from Hong Kong University, City University, and he was talking about, democracies and things like that. And I was asking him, what about Hong Kong? Is Hong Kong a democracy or not? And his answer says, no, it's an autocratic liberal whatever, system. Okay, here maybe, I don't know how you classify it, maybe it's a sort of a hybrid. I mean, you have a big brother looking over your shoulder, yeah, in Hong Kong. So how does that play out over time? And how are the democratic forces going to align or realign in that context is also interesting to see, okay? Because that would seem to be closer to Southeast Asian, what I would call Southeast Asian democratic model than Northeast Asian. You know what I mean? I don't know whether you share my views, my observations. Thank you.
Okay, please. Introduce yourself.
Alex speaking here. The panelists raised various other examples of countries outside of Southeast Asia that experience similar phenomena. But what can we learn from Western countries that experience the same class-based struggles? Because Britain, France, Spain, and the Nordic countries also experienced severe class-based struggles and a very reactionary middle class. But they've now passed beyond that stage of their political development. What lessons, if any, can we take from those countries that have gone through the same phase and passed beyond it?
One more question, please. Okay then. Would you like to speak first?
I'll respond briefly, but on the class regional thing, I thought maybe Ajarn might give us her insight on her research on those questions, since she's done some phenomenal research also in that area, so maybe we should bring her into the discussion more directly. So let me combine maybe two questions. Sorry, your name Maniton? Is that right? Sorry, yeah. Your second question on future of Southeast Asia for middle class to be more democratic, and the question of Alex about the political development of European nations and what lessons we can get out of that. So let me take that in one answer, and say that the political development in Europe in the late 19th and early 20th century was clear class cleavages, class struggles between working class pushing hard for the opening up of the parliamentary system against the conservatives and liberals, and in the process pushing for social welfare states. That was in numerous countries, from England to Germany, Scandinavian countries. You saw that process in action, this clear class cleavage, pursuing both political change in terms of opening up the franchise, as well as an increasing social welfare state. The consequence of that, with a strong labor social movement, was the development of very strong political parties. Parties rooted in class, having a social base, being very programmatic, and because they were rooted in strong class and labor movements, they became quite institutionalized. Eventually that penetrated the parliamentary system, and they also were able to pursue policies that were driven by social welfare. That type of political development is completely absent, for the most part, completely absent in Southeast Asia. And so that gets to your question of, what future might we have for democracy in the middle class in Southeast Asia? One might argue that Singapore Singapore has had some class cleavage linked with anti-colonialism that helped build up the PAP. So there's some element of that. By no means is it the same model as Europe in the late 19th and early 20th century, but across the board, from Philippines to Indonesia, Malaysia very much rooted in ethnic conflict, or class and ethnicity converge, but very much about ethnicity. Thailand, you have not had this kind of strong labor movement succeeding in entering the parliamentary system and having strong left-leaning parties rooted and institutionalized within the party system, competing with other conservative and moderate parties. That dynamic has completely failed in large part because the left has been physically attacked, destroyed, and undermined. So to get to to move then to Maniton's question, my response would be, how might we work with the middle class towards a more democratic outcome? I'm a big believer in party building and institution building, and to the extent that the middle class can see in organizations that compete democratically some type of reform that is moderate and pragmatic,
then that might be one path to pursue. But the parties also have to be, the Democratic Party model, I don't think is really an effective model. It's a very narrow model. So ideally, it would be political parties that could cater to the Democratic Party in Thailand, but ideally be a political party that could cater to the middle class, but also has more social democratic leanings. So not a sort of conservative, typical conservative middle class party, but a party that caters to a middle class intelligentsia that is able to build up a social base and build organization from the grassroots onwards, and be able to bring in a significant part of the middle class to believe in that party as a basis for democratic development.
Very good. Okay, follow up our Faculty of Political Science website. We're gonna launch another public talk on this series, and I'm gonna talk about my research. Otherwise, I'm gonna steal the scene from this guy. Okay, I will give this part to Ajarn Prajak to respond to some leftover questions and comments, and then he might take this opportunity to close the session here. So the panel is yours.
Okay, just briefly, I think back to Indonesia case, I agree that it's not, we cannot be too much optimistic about the role of the middle class in supporting democracy in Indonesia, as many scholars on Indonesian politics point out today that middle class actually getting more conservative in the past few years. Their support to the radical Islamic movement actually is quite a worrying trend. In the Assoc case, bring down the very popular elected governor of Jakarta. And so overall, I think we are talking about middle class in relationship to democracy by trying to contextualize it. And I think everything is always contingent, right, in this sense. So depending on the institutional structure, historical development, and different institutional environment, the party structure, all these things matter in explaining the role of the middle class. But on the last question, on the regional difference, regional cleavages, actually it supports Professor Erik argument, because when you talk about the hegemonic idea, it applies across the region, right? So it can overcome the regional difference. People can subscribe to this hegemonic idea, irrespective of your class, occupation, and regional backgrounds. So, I mean, I criticize Erik argument, but actually I believe in ideological factor. But that it is very strong in the case of Thailand. But look at the future, I'm not sure. And that link to the question on the future of democracy and the role of the middle class. Because the Thai style democracy center on a strong and stable relationship between the military and monarchy, Since regime. The institutional change will lead to the ideological change too in the future. So this hegemonic idea might not be hegemonic in the long run. So and that's another point that I forgot to mention. I think you make it too static. I mean, about the hegemonic ideology in Thailand and in Singapore. And I think the Thai style democracy it emerged out of a very specific context of Soviet era, and it will not be the same under current regime and in the future. And actually, we might have to thank NCPO, because NCPO forced Democrat Party, Prajadhipok, to adapt itself. And now, if you look at the rhetoric of Democrat Party leaders, including the young member like Kuhonta of Democrat Party, they are very strong in supporting the liberal democratic ideas. Right? They shift their ideology a bit in order to differentiate themselves from the military-backed party. I think that might good for democracy in Thailand if all political parties stick to the democratic principle and accept democratic election as a platform. Okay, and but we don't know what would happen in the future. Okay, I talk too much now. I think it's time to close this session, and I want everyone in the room to give a big applause to all the panelists today. Thank you everyone for attending this seminar, and as Ajarn Viengrat said, there will be other seminars coming up, and I hope that Thammasat and Chulalongkorn political science faculties can have a future collaboration. Okay. Thank you.